coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
It is funny, like, do you guys remember when Claudine Gay's plagiarism was kind of coming up to the surface, and the main line of defense from her like colleagues in the academy was, well, who among us, right? I mean, we all lift chunks out of other people's essays and just sort of airdrop them into our own, And there was this insane kind of like, obviously not like, isn't this so relatable content when the people saying it would never ever have done anything like this, and definitely the people they were talking to, most of them were not academics, would certainly never think to do this stuff. So it's like that was the line on Claudine Gay, and now this is a thing that people actually do all the time, that is like everybody, all and with but since it's Trump, it's like we are going to just hold you to the letter of the law, to the nth degree. I mean, it is sort of a funny like double, like this is actually a case where, right, as you say, Seth, like whom among us has not like listed his cat as a you could sell it for $1,000 or something. That's not a real example, I promise. Don't come for me, IRS.
Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable. You haven't heard me, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, as host in a while, but Seth and I are going to start switching off as hosts to relieve Spencer of some duties. He just has too much to do and too much good Claremont Institute work to do. You may have noticed some regular readers of the Claremont Review books that Spencer's publishing nearly every issue, either a review or an essay. He also seems to be cranking out a book every 18 months, so we were happy to relieve Spencer. And to say nothing of his side project podcast, Young Heretics. So this will be a labor of love for me and Seth. And I think we haven't quite worked it out yet, but we might try to have a little more regular guests on the show too. Like any venture, after years and years of doing it, it can get just kind of rote, and we want to mix it up a little bit. So welcome to the Roundtable and the editors and publishers podcast here at The American Mind. I'm joined by Seth Barron, managing editor of The American Mind, and Spencer Clavin, assistant editor of the Claremont Review books and features editor of The American Mind. Are you associate editor or assistant editor?
I'm associate editor. But after you said so many nice things about me, Ryan, it's perfectly fine.
Well, it's weird because in academia, it's reversed, right? Associate is the lower one, and then assistant professor is the higher one. So sorry for demoting you in publishing land. We have lots to talk about today. We wanted to start with New York Attorney General Letitia James's attempt to sort of a modern day. Trump has not been lustrated yet, sent out to the countryside, but she is trying to seize most of his assets. So Trump had this judgment in this sort of absurd tax case out of New York, claiming that despite all of his creditors being perfectly happy with his performance, vetting him themselves, they were sophisticated financial institutions giving him loans. The claim was that Trump, and for those of you who know this through and through, forgive us, the claim was that Trump inflated his net worth to get more favorable loan terms. And so he has handed down this judgment of $454 million. I think now it's about $464 with interest. And he has to post a bond for it in order even to appeal. And his lawyers came back to court and said they've really been unable to find a bondsman to do this size of a bond. And Trump, of course, is a billionaire, but fairly illiquid, as many, or somewhat illiquid, I suppose, as many real estate types are. A lot of his money's tied up in physical assets. So it's hard to just snap one's fingers and conjure up $500 million. So the consequence now could be that Letitia James will start seizing properties to meet this to meet this gap that Trump has to meet. I'll just open with this question and see what you guys think. I wonder how broader normal America thinks about this as they see it, to the extent that they see it. I mean, the partisans on the left love it. Anything to get Trump is great. Anything to despoil him and bankrupt him and inhibit his ability to conduct a campaign in the next year is wonderful. The partisans on the right, of course, are against all of it, root and branch. It's illegitimate down to its core, and really just a form of lawfare. But normal Americans watching this, I wonder if they, on balance, might side a little more instinctually with the right on this question than the left, and just regard it as part of the negative atmospherics and sort of dark turn of our modern politics, and so it might actually backfire on them. That's what I hope in the voting booth. People will just say, even maybe some independents who or don't really like Trump or not inclined to like Trump, and many, even some never Trump Republicans might turn, hold your nose and vote Trump, because they just think this sort of thing and the other lawfare efforts against Trump just can't really stand. And so for that reason alone, a protest vote against the current regime is in order. You think I'm right or too optimistic?
Maybe. Kevin O'Leary, the guy from Shark Tank, has been making the rounds on this point quite a bit. And I think he's made an excellent point, which is like, forget about Trump or how you feel about him. This entire project smacks of like the worst kind of third world communist despotism, like to go in and seize the assets of your political enemies based on a case that is so refracted and tortured that it doesn't make any sense. And even when you hear people defend it as like, well, we have to protect other we need to protect the market, and if people are allowed to inflate their assets in lending, it can affect future borrowers, because I mean it's the most twisted logic to defend it. I sort of have to think that it doesn't look good. And as O'Leary says, this is terrible for New York's brand. I mean, I thought it was very interesting that Kathy Hochul, the governor, had to make a point of reassuring investors, saying, "Oh, no, this won't impact you. This was just about Trump. We're not going to start going after other people we don't like and seizing their
Who do the
assets,
same
or
thing.
yeah, who do the same thing, which is everybody, every single person."
Right.
I mean, if you fill out any loan application, they ask you to talk about your assets. Nobody underestimates what they're worth for these purposes.
Now we have
It's
to
so
be everyone has to be
insane.
really careful with. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, I feel like you can either look at the sort of enormous pile of lawsuits that are on Trump now. You can look at it in one of two ways, right? You either say the very fact that he's being attacked in all of these ways, that he has all of these lawsuits against him, just shows what an unprecedented, beyond the pale figure he is. He's like so illegal that he's got all of these court cases against him. And if he weren't doing something wrong, he wouldn't have this like huge pileup. But I sort of agree with you, Ryan, that to maintain that attitude, you sort of already have to have that opinion about Trump. Like, if you don't think that he is the great Satan, then you probably weren't persuaded that he was by the fact that they charged him for, as Seth is saying, like basically nothing. It's something that everybody does. And then you're more likely to look at all of these cases, if you think about them at all, and be like, what, like 37 of the same counts? Like, this doesn't kind of wash. And even the things that maybe you didn't like about Trump now just look like pretexts for what is basically like, an expropriation campaign. Like this thing where they're just taking all of his money is kind of wild. And yeah, my only like other anecdote about this is from my very important sample pool of the bros at the gym, who are like, your classic low information but sort of sound intuition voters a lot of the time. And they don't really I don't think they're paying that much attention to any of this stuff at all. One thing I will say is there does seem to be like a weird effect that's going on where all of the stuff that was supposed to be so terrible about Trump, like even the things that maybe did give people pause, like the January 6th of it all. It's all bundled up and associated with the COVID years, which people just want to forget, like root to branch. Nobody wants to think about that. So even those people who do have some reservations about like what happened at the end of the Trump presidency, it's kind of in this haze of amnesia. And what they have instead is, food costing twice as much at the grocery store and crime skyrocketing and all of these obvious things that are plainly linked to Biden. So I don't know. It's early days, but that's kind of the vibe I get.
Yeah, I remember there was sort of, it was mostly in jest, but I think some people even meant it a little seriously. But back when Trump had the mugshot, they thought, now black men will identify with Trump more because he too has been gotten by the man. I wonder if there's like a white collar analog here where, average bourgeois upper middle class independent voter says, well, I exaggerate my assets frequently when I take out loans. Seth, New York politics better than any of us. What is Letitia James's deal? What's her sort of MO and her history in the state?
I mean, she's kind of a hack. She was a legal aid attorney, and then her predecessor in the city council was actually assassinated
Wow, really?
in City Hall, and she ran against his brother, and won a special election to city council. And I mean, look, she is an attorney, so that gives her a little bit more, I don't know, class or status than a lot of city council members. Um, Thing is, she kind of has a history of doing weird, like, okay, one time, and this was so strange. She was jaywalking. She was crossing the street and like walking between parked cars, and she bumped her leg on a trailer hitch and I guess hurt herself. And she sued the owner of the pickup truck, who was like this black guy from upstate who had no money, and his whole livelihood was like basically salvaging old radiators for scrap metal for their like iron value or whatever. And she was basically harassing this guy with like some lawsuit claiming that the trailer hitch stuck out too far.
Hmm.
And it was just like bizarre. It was like
Wait,
really
was she
weird.
in office at this point? Like, was she a public
Yeah.
figure?
Yeah. She was a council member. And,
Yeah.
and like finally she dropped it. And then another time, like there was a chicken place in her district on Fulton Plaza in Brooklyn that had a special, like 50-cent wings Tuesday afternoons or something like that, or I don't remember what day of the week. And there was like a big riot where all these kids, whatever, came, and I think there maybe somebody was shot or stabbed, and she demanded that the chicken restaurant and the promotion, and kind of made this whole thing that she wanted the business license seized, and that, like, I think she made some claim that like this wouldn't have happened in a white area, like you wouldn't dare do, basically implying that it was some kind of like racist plot to have like
to come
this
in and
after school.
offer chicken low price and
Yeah.
thereby
So she's kind of, and then she became the public advocate, which is like a nonsense position in New York City. And then after Schneiderman, who was the previous attorney general, like he had to quit because he was, he liked to beat up women and like do like weird race play with like his lovers, like, I don't know, just crazy stuff. Eric Schneiderman, who was like considered like probably going to be the governor. I mean, he was a hugely popular progressive Democrat who was then memory hold. So she became attorney general. But the thing is, when she ran for attorney general, her whole case was for election was that she would dig through Trump's past and find something to convict, to prosecute him for. And she would just talk about this with the most like rotund oratorical
Mm.
like seriousness, as though this was a legitimate thing for a top prosecutor to talk about.
Yeah,
Like,
well, because she was begging the question, right? Like it was a foregone conclusion that anything she could find would be the right tool or a good tool to use for the
yeah, it was
preordained.
classic like Stalinist stuff, show me the man and I'll find the crime. And look, New York's for various reasons, New York's attorney general is incredibly powerful. Like they can investigate virtually anything they want because of this 1930s act called the Martin Act. They don't need to have cause necessarily. They can basically just investigate anything at any time. It's like a star chamber.
Mhm.
And this is what she's using it for. This and going after like the NRA and VDARE and it's all very political. It's she probably wants to be governor.
Hmm.
I mean, she's a disaster. She's a total
Hmm.
disaster.
It is
Yeah.
funny. Like, do you guys remember when Claudine Gay's plagiarism was kind of coming up to the surface, and the main line of defense from her like colleagues in the academy was, well, who among us, right? I mean, we all lift chunks out of other people's essays and just sort of airdrop them into our own, And there was this insane kind of like obviously not like isn't this so relatable content when the people saying it would never ever have done anything like this, and definitely the people they were talking to, most of
Right.
whom were not academics, would certainly never think to do this stuff. So it's like that was the line on Claudine Gay, and now this is a thing that people actually do all the time, that is like
Mhm.
everybody all and with but since it's Trump, it's like we are going to just hold you to the letter of the law, to the nth degree. I mean, it is sort of a funny like double. Like this is actually a case where, right, as you say, Seth, like whom among us has not like listed his cat as a you could sell it for $1,000 or something. That's not a real example. I promise. Don't come for me, IRS. But like, yeah, no, I mean it is very.
That's extraordinary. You'd think after the long list of infamous New York attorney generals, there might be a groundswell of support for revising the Martin Act, Seth. I mean, just you running through Schneiderman and then Letitia James. Of course, this is ancient history now, but who was it? Spitzer, the guy who liked high-end
Yes,
hookers?
yes, sir.
Yeah.
And Cuomo, who
Yeah,
had to step down as governor eventually. I
right.
mean, yeah, it's a shady list.
Yeah, it's one of the pitfalls of electing your main prosecutors. You see, New York is not alone in having abusive attorney generals courting. I mean, really, in a way, they're demagogues. They're sort of lawfare demagogues because they want to use it to climb to higher office. So,
And let me just add that the judge in that particular case, this guy Arthur Engeron,
yeah,
New
Oh yeah.
York is also alone in the country in how we elect judges. Like they don't go through a primary. They're essentially just appointed by the party committee
Mhm.
uh, to hold the line, and then they're elected usually with no opposition. And this guy is just a classic Democrat hack. I think he was like a drummer and then a drum teacher, and he got a law degree somewhere. And 20 years ago, I don't know what he did or like what kind of favors he did for the local Democrats, but he got a judgeship. Um, New York is really, really, really corrupt in its
mm,
judiciary,
Wasn't this the
and
guy that like, oh, if the jury doesn't convict him, I can just basically throw that out, and sort of decide
well,
myself
I
that
think
he's
he
guilty.
did. I think he ruled before the trial started. Like, yes,
Right.
it's been determined that Trump committed fraud. There's no question that he committed
Right.
fraud. That yeah, the prosecution, the state has made its point, and we don't need a trial about that. I don't really understand how this works, like civil
Mm.
procedure and all of that, but that's I think that's what he did, and it just
Well,
seems
it's
so
funny
perverse
because
to me.
Well,
No,
that
go
was
ahead.
also the logic of that Colorado thing where they took him off the ballot, right? It was like it says you can't be on the ballot if you did an insurrection. And since we know that Trump did an insurrection, he's off the ballot. Like that's kind of how all
Right.
of these things seem to be working.
Yeah. It's kind of ugly, and I think O'Leary is right that it's bad for the American brand to pursue this. I mean, was it Caldwell who talks about the law being like the soft underbelly of like the American, I don't know, project, because it's open to all kinds of abuse. You can
Hmm.
just get in there and really slip a knife in.
Yeah, he brings up this great old legal term uh, in his book Age of Entitlement: America Since the '60s. And he talks, it's for him it's in the context of civil rights law, but he says so much of it seems to be a species of barratry, which is sort of
Uh huh.
rule by law, for lack of a better term, rather than rule of law, and harassment through litigation of civil rights flavor. But yeah, it's one of the many things that needs some serious reform in this country. Well, let's move on from the venerable Letitia James to Murthy versus Missouri, this case that just went through oral argument at the Supreme Court. It's a suit brought by some names some of our listeners will know: Jay Bhattacharya, Aaron Cariati, Martin Koldorf, all three of them academics, and then Jill Hines, who's sort of more of I think an activist type, or wanted to raise the issue of COVID lockdowns and mask mandates and vaccines and all the rest. And the argument is that from the plaintiffs is that and they had rulings in their favor in the Fifth Circuit that basically said the government, through its wink wink nod nod, half strong arm sort of tactics in often daily communication with social media companies, uh, amounted to effectively a violation of the First Amendment. So the government is prohibited, of course, from directly threatening or in order to stifle speech and that sort of thing. But the argument from the government in this case was that really they were just exercising their First Amendment rights to persuade social media companies that X, Y, or Z would be a bad idea and should be taken care of. And it looked at oral argument like there was not a majority of the court persuaded that this was in fact a violation of the First Amendment. Just read quickly so this suit, the lawyers in it are our friends at the New Civil Liberties Alliance. They have the following to say just in describing it. So they posted this on the day of the oral argument, which was March 18th. In September, a Fifth Circuit panel upheld the key components of U.S. District Judge Terry Doughty's July 4 preliminary injunction order prohibiting named federal officials from coercing or significantly encouraging social media companies to suppress legal speech. That decision vindicated NCLA's, that's New Civil Liberties Alliance, this a good, interesting group started by Phil Hamburger, a friend of the Institute, vindicated our clients who've been blacklisted, shadow banned, deboosted, throttled, and suspended on social media as part of a years-long censorship campaign orchestrated by the White House, CDC, FBI, CISA, and Surgeon General in a whole of government effort. This censorship regime has successfully suppressed perspectives contradicting government-approved views on hotly disputed topics such as whether natural immunity to COVID exists, the safety and efficacy of COVID vaccines, the virus's origins, and mask mandate efficacy. The vast, coordinated silencing of First Amendment protected speech has targeted influential, highly qualified voices, including doctors and scientists like Doctors Bhattacharya, Cariati, and Koldorf, as well as those like Ms. Hines, who have tried to raise awareness of issues. So, not an encouraging tea leaf read, which seemed to be the consensus across both left and right of the oral arguments. Justice Alito was pretty skeptical of the government's position, but it looks like maybe Roberts and Kavanaugh might side with the liberals on this question. I don't know. What do you guys make of all this? It's I think the troubling part of it is that everyone who comes into interaction with the federal government at an individual level, or anyone who's knowledgeable about federal law enforcement knows it would be foolish ever to speak with the FBI without an attorney present, that sort of thing. There was this book from a Cato scholar years ago. I don't know if it was 5 or 6, or something like 5 felonies a day. Just the
Mhm.
broad expanse of federal law is so far-reaching and detailed and lengthy that you can indict a ham sandwich if you want to, using any number of federal tools. The old quip about a grand jury. And so the troubling thing to me is that it seems to be that, if from what we saw at oral argument, or heard at oral argument, I should say, as long as the government has the thinnest plausible argument that they're just presenting views, they're just in contact with their counterparts at large social media companies, then it does not amount to suppression of speech. But it seems to fly in the face of common sense of how the federal government operates, and how people who may be liable on the corporate institutional level or on the individual level would regard the federal government normally, which is with skepticism, fear, and trepidation.
Well, we're perfectly comfortable observing this when it's another country, as we just talked about last week with ByteDance and
Yeah.
the CCP. It's like we all can see obviously what's going on there. It doesn't matter what the formal relationship is or isn't between this media company and this government. It turns out that that government is sort of authoritarian, but it's like the main point here is they're clearly in hock to one another. And right, if the if the president says, will no one rid me of this meddlesome, epidemiologist or whatever, of course you're gonna like feel intense pressure to do that. I just keep thinking with this stuff, I don't know, I'm not the legal scholar who can effectively articulate what the right route is to addressing this, but I just keep thinking that the most kind of direct historical precedent to think about is the East India Company, where you had this situation that the crown would incorporate these companies to go off and exercise monopolies in certain regions, and then they would become effectively little mini governments unto themselves. And then you have this parastate entity, which, as Edmund Burke famously says, there reaches a point where they basically either have to represent the crown and live by the crown's rules, or they have to divest from their monopoly on this like major area of traffic that is of concern to every Englishman and everyone in the world. And I just think that's basically the kind of entanglement we have here. It's also a major part of like the problem we have with NGOs, which function effectively as little mini American imperial governments. And like you can kind of split the hairs on which legal argument is most effective to make, but the outline of the problem is, to me, really clear. And the New York Times just ran this story being like, oh, like the data says that closing schools for like 4 years and keeping children locked up at home turns out to have had like all of these really traumatic and adverse developmental effects, and also like, wow, didn't really do anything to stop the spread of the virus. Who could have known? And it's like, this is the stuff that they were like axing off of social media while it was happening. And now they have the temerity to be like, like studies show. It's like, yeah, studies been showing, dog. Like, so yeah, I don't know. I think the whole thing is an outrage, and I wish that there would have been a more encouraging display from the judges at oral arguments, but this may not be the one that kind of remedies the problem.
Last night I had I actually had the privilege last night of attending a dinner where Bill Hamburger was sort of talking about all of this.
Oh, nice.
And yeah, he didn't seem necessarily super, I don't want to speak for him, but like super enthusiastic about getting a great response on this. I did ask him about Ketanji Brown Jackson's remark
Oh yeah.
that she was concerned that this line of argument could hamper the government's might restrict the government's freedom of speech.
Yeah.
And he was saying, like, this is akin to the idea that, that rights derive from the government, that the government is the one who has rights and gives rights, not that, this continental view, which is pernicious and which the left has really absorbed. And he said that I mean, he was saying that sort of to what Spencer was saying, that the tech companies all had to work together to make sure that the right people were banned,
Hmm.
but they couldn't really do it directly because that would be in violation of antitrust legislation. So that's why the government really needed to be in
Oh, it's
there.
just a go-between. Yeah.
Yeah, like, just to keep it all like legal. Um so yeah, it's perverse. And he was talking about all of the problems of how do you assign, what kind of fault is there? And once if the government, even if the government says, okay, yeah, we help to censor you in this situation, we won't do that again. But what does that
Yeah.
cure? Like, that doesn't change the problem. So I don't know. It does seem like it's a really difficult case, and it's a difficult problem. I don't even know if like one Supreme Court decision, even if it were really a strong one, would fix it necessarily.
That's the thing, right, Seth? Like, it's sort of a conundrum. I mean, Ryan, you would maybe know best. Like, what is there a precedent here in American history? People are always citing the robber barons, but I don't really think that's quite what we're talking about. It's like much more structural than that. And it does seem like a bit of a vulnerable weak point, kind of like we were talking about in the last segment about the law being this kind of weaponizable tool. um, what's the remedy?
Well, I think this is one of the rocks on which the ship of positivism crashes, and that's it seems to be the case with Kavanaugh and Roberts at least.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is this kind of narrow legalism and proceduralism of too many, I think, of our judges on the right, at the expense of an older tradition of kind of judicial reasoning and even natural law judicial reasoning, sort of natural right, if I can offend many of our Straussian listeners, natural right judicial reasoning. That is to say, I mean, the old principle that would apply here, I would think, and you encounter it in old jurisprudence on the enumerated powers of Congress. What the federal government can't do directly, it can't do indirectly. And this seems to be a clear case of that. So I would hope that our judges and justices would be able to reason out loud through that sort of an argument and come down on the right side of this case. But I suspect that we're going to get a much more narrow legalistic take on it that permits it, at least for now. Maybe there needs to be more smoking guns. I mean, at a certain point in oral argument, so I mean, some of these emails are, it's pretty hard to defend them as mere persuasion by government agents. I mean, it's a lot of, morning of repeatedly uh, emails from White House officials saying this account is spreading disinformation. Uh, and came up in oral argument, and the lawyer for the government basically said, well, these are unusual emails, but they're really the exception, and really what's going on here is much more usual, just interfacing between the government and social media companies. The other problem, of course, is that, as was clear in a lot of the Twitter files, the people who populate the senior ranks of a lot of the social media companies are not only sympathetic to the government's line, or were sympathetic to the government's line on quote unquote COVID disinformation, but many of them are former intelligence community
Hmm.
denizens who then switched over to social media to make some more money. So you have this unholy alliance or revolving door, pick your metaphor, between the intelligence community and the executive branch, very broadly speaking, and the higher ranks of a lot of these tech companies, and the switching back and forth between those, the sort of circulation of elites in that area just meant the government was pushing on an open door. So, um, they didn't even really need to do much persuading. I think everyone was of like mind, unfortunately. And that's just another factor that complicates this case. I mean, if you had more of a record of strenuously objecting um, Facebook officials, and then a little more soft strong arming by the government, maybe a case like that would be a little
Hmm.
easier for some of our less stalwart conservative justices. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. I would hope that we'll get some powerful dissents and or concurrences from some of the usual suspects to help normal citizens continue to think through this problem and demand some shift in policy.
This is a part of the story that I'm sure James would tell if he were here, and I can't really tell well in his absence. But it's not just right-wing nutcases like us. It's also sort of like old school Marxists even who are currently looking back and realizing this kind of expressed collusion between tech power and state power goes back to like, you know, the Patriot Act and then very much the Obama years, especially of just like the CIA kind of suddenly realizing that underneath its feet there's this enormous surveillance apparatus that it just has to switch on the lights, and basically now it has all these new tools at its disposal. And why wouldn't we play with these toys? So there's probably like more of that needs to go in, and then also that like Ketanji Jackson thing is kind of clarifying. Like it matters also that those are the guys that Phil Hamburger and et cetera are up against. It's like people that think the government isn't doing enough censorship, like worry that there's not enough power to like shut people up.
Yeah, this headline from the New York Times, which I think dropped this morning, also comes to mind. It's something like, "There is a deep state, and it's kind of awesome."
Yeah. This is already, there was thank God for the deep state like several years ago, wasn't there?
Yeah, I know. And you know, years ago we talked about, you know, never Trumpers like Bill Kristol tweeting stuff like, you know, if my choice is between the deep state and the Trump state, I'll take the deep state. This sort of the abandonment of old school liberal skepticism about state power and abuse is just another troubling development in our modern discourse. I will just flag for everyone, for those of you who are nerdy book lovers on topics like this, bigger picture, just I'll shill a bit for Philip Hamburger, who founded the New Civil Liberties Alliance and Seth heard from last night in New York. A couple of his, I mean, all of his books are excellent, but two favorites of mine, Law and Judicial Duty. If you want sort of the definitive history of judicial review and where it fits in the Western tradition of law and order, Law and Judicial Duty by Phil Hamburger is great. His day job's at Columbia. He's a legal historian. And then more recent book is Administrative Law Unlawful. And you can learn about all sorts of interesting things in there, like how our modern approach to administrative law and bureaucracy in America traces its lineage back to the dispute over the nature of sovereignty and state power between the continent and call it Lockean Anglo-Protestantism, are the political philosophical roots of it and how executive power should be regarded. Very interesting books if you're into that sort of thing. I will now move us on to, you know, it would be absurd to say that I'd forgotten about her, but she'd been out of sight and out of mind for so long. And with our current pace of politics and the COVID era seemingly accelerating space-time, it feels like Christine Blasey Ford's testimony was 100 years ago. But no, she's back with a new book. And so we wanted to talk about the return of Christine Blasey Ford, including her circulation amongst the normal, you know, talk shows and The View and all the rest. I will just turn to our Lincoln alum, Lincoln Fellowship alum, Molly Hemingway, who of course wrote a book on this, co-authored a book on this with Carrie Severino about the Kavanaugh hearings. Carrie was a great co-author for that book, with Molly acting as sort of journalist and Carrie acting as the insider, because Carrie worked very hard on Kavanaugh's confirmation, sort of behind the scenes, as both sides do on these sorts of things. But Molly's, she retweeted this clip from The View, or it may not have been in The View, sorry, it's Sarah Haynes on ABC interviewing Blasey Ford. And even she said, even today, some people remain skeptical of your story. So Molly took this as the occasion to give the following list. 1, there's no evidence that Ford and Kavanaugh ever met. 2, Leland Kaiser said she did not have any confidence in her friend's story. That's Blasey Ford's friend. 3, friends pressured Kaiser to change her story. 4, all alleged witnesses strongly dispute the claim. 5, Blasey Ford's father supported Kavanaugh's confirmation. 6, Ford doesn't know the location. 7, Ford doesn't know how she arrived. 8, Ford does not know how she got home. 9, Ford does not know the date. or even what time of week. I'll stop numbering them because it bogs us down. Ford somehow remembers she had precisely one beer, but not other details. Kavanaugh's contemporaneous calendars support his claim. Ford changed the date of the incident by years from her initial stories. Character witnesses from the time support Kavanaugh. Ford's first mention of Kavanaugh's name is 2012, after he became a national figure, and decades, of course, after the alleged incident. False claims were made about Ford's inability to fly. Ford scrubbed her social media. Ford said she wanted to stay confidential, but first call was to the Washington Post. Ford's attorney admitted a motive of desiring an asterisk by Kavanaugh's name. Ford has benefited politically, financially, and socially. And then finally, nothing in Kavanaugh's past remotely similar to the claim for 37 years. So I guess we have to do this again. I think savvy observers may have some theories as to why we're doing it at precisely this moment. What do you guys think?
Well, it's funny. Just the other day, I was talking to somebody and I was saying, well, Christine Blasey Ford, she was such a big deal. And then she just vanished from the scene. And I Googled her and I was like, oh, what? She has a book coming out and she's going to be on TV. How convenient. We have a piece up at the site right now by Emmett Hare, who's written for us some. And he's a political, I wouldn't say strategist, but he's an operative. And he was writing about the white women as a block and how both sides have been fighting over this demographic segment for 8 years now, ever since 2016, when supposedly, well, when evidently they turned against Hillary, and this was seen as a huge treason. Well, the Blasey Ford reemergence seems peculiarly timed. And, and I guess you would connect it to like Kara Swisher a couple of weeks ago saying, we just have to keep calling Trump a rapist, and George Stephanopoulos calling Trump a rapist. And now Blasey Ford is back calling Kavanaugh a rapist. I think that maybe this is part of the Democrats' November strategy, is just to keep reminding white women that the Republicans are rapists. And this is, I think, maybe why, this is why Emmett Hare suggests she has reemerged right now, fresh faced. And, I just remember, it's funny. Let me just say, like, when she came forward in 2018, I guess, I really did think like, okay, well, this sinks Kavanaugh. Like, there's no way. Like, thinking like the way Republicans behave is just so reactive that like I really figured that there wouldn't be the stomach to rise against this. But and I was impressed actually that like Trump stood behind him. Kavanaugh kept it going. I kind of got a certain degree of hope from the whole thing that maybe Republicans have the fortitude and the gumption to like stand up against leftist lying and fight through it.
Well,
Now I'm not so sure.
Well, we were talking about the possibility of things backfiring in the context of the tax case with Trump, but I recall, and I've told the story here, I think, but it's been on many, many months, if not years. That was a huge inflection point for a certain segment of Trump skeptical Republican. And it's not that then they then became, Trump lovers. It's just that whole escapade or circus around the Kavanaugh Blasey Ford thing. I mean, I remember talking distinctly to one of our alums who lives out here on the West Coast, and he was part of a group of folks who are much more enthusiastic about Cruz and over Trump, and were a little bit bitter about Trump's winning the primary. And they find better to have a Republican president than not, but they continue to be skeptical. And they poo-pooed, I think, some of the arguments that we had made at the Claremont Institute and our colleague Mike Anton had made about the state of the country and how that justified at least taking a chance on something different like Trump, a true outsider. And one with some decent policy ideas. And it was at that point after Kavanaugh that I talked to one of them, and I had lunch with him, and he said, "You guys were right. You were right. This is much worse than we thought. And thank God that Trump's in office rather than someone else. How could this sort of thing even transpire these days? It's outrageous and portends bad things about American politics. So we should remember the pretty radicalizing effect that the whole Kavanaugh circus had on a lot of Republicans.
I mean, it was psychotic. Like, it's easy to forget because we now act as a country like somebody with a drinking problem who has these manic episodes and then wakes up and kind of hazes over them. Like, we don't want to remember. But this was a moral panic unlike anything I, at the time, had ever seen. I mean, I was in grad school, and it just, like, I was astonished to find otherwise completely seemingly sane and normal people just losing their ever-loving marbles over a totally indefensible claim that, as you just listed off, Ryan, had like no backing at all. And suddenly it was just like, this man must be cast into the pit of hell. Like, it was really high octane stuff. The white woman thing is really interesting, Seth. Like, white women they're just dangling by a thread from the minority coalition of the ascendant, right? It's like they get to count as oppressed people, but they're kind of like, gay white men in this way, especially, as they say, neurotypical gay white men. It's like if you break ranks for even a second, you are suddenly the great pariah. It's like, when white women are their Karens and they can't stand, they have their white feminism. And I mean, this stuff was already in like bell hooks back in the 1970s. And, when Betty Friedan thought that she had like, seized the upper hand and really gained the moral trump card with the feminine mystique, then suddenly the newer model comes along and she's like, well, actually, like, your feminism insufficiently takes into account the working class black and brown women. And like, white women have been in that position among the kind of new left ever since. And now it is particularly intense. So because of the trans thing, which has come along and just totally blown the lid off of the whole feminist project and like radicalized it in this totally new way and basically made it about men again. And you've got this whole TERF label, which is what happens if you even like, dare to kind of, and so they're basically just trying to keep the lid on this totally incoherent and self-destructive group of interests that are increasingly not aligned with one another. And yeah, the rapist thing is the only way to kind of keep that whole thing from boiling over, is to just be like, they're going to come and they're going to rip your unborn child like out of your belly, or they're going to like, they're going to impregnate you and then force you to give birth, like just these insane, lurid fantasies about what Trump represents and what the Republicans want to do to you. Because otherwise, like, what's in the Democrat Party anymore for like women as an interest? They're basically like, they're chopped liver otherwise.
And don't forget the insanity of the Kavanaugh hearings, where an organized group of hardcore leftists disrupted the hearing, like, with all the protesters, one after another, screaming that Kavanaugh was a rapist. Those two women, I've written about this because they were both like big in the New York City nonprofit scene. Those two women who cornered Jeff Flake in an elevator, screaming at him. I mean, all of this was, should have resulted in January 6th style prosecutions. It was an organized effort to, interfere with government operations. It was unlawful, imprisonment, essentially, when they, hemmed him into this elevator and refused to let him leave or go anywhere. Yeah, it was a complete meltdown, which was totally staged and stage managed, because as soon as he was sworn in, it was like, oh, all right, whatever.
Right.
On to the next
because we then immediately had to forget about it. It was so insane that like
Yeah.
if it had remained in the public memory, it would basically be a black mark upon every Democrat politician. That, I mean, in the same way that 2020 had to be basically memorable, like all the riots and all of that. Like we can't talk about that anymore, because then you'd have to open up the whole, Kamala Harris like basically incited insurrection, and
Yeah.
all the January 6th stuff is like a drop in this vast ocean of civil discord. Yeah, they really have to like, and people, this is in the same way that it helps Trump for 2020 to be kind of forgotten. It also really helps it with all of these like leftist uprisings that basically purposefully inflict trauma on people to hold them hostage so that they'll do what the Democrats want. Like they have to do that, but then they also have to make sure you forget about it. And it helps that it's a traumatic memory, because you don't really want to think about that. Like most people don't want to look back on these periods when they're being held to account for like, did you post the black square? Did you post the hashtag that you stand with women? So I mean, this is a classic, now that I think about it, sort of tactic that abusers use, right? Is they will like be unkind to you and cause you pain, and then they rely on your passivity to like not bring it up, or to not even want to think about it because you're conflict averse. And that's how, like, that's the codependent relationship.
Yeah.
Not to like, turn this into a therapy session or something. I'm not in an abusive relationship. Nobody way.
No, I'll, what's the name of, the show that you hate, Spencer, Foundation? What's the name
There's
of
so many.
Yeah. What's the name of like the theory that I forget what it's, psychometrics?
Psychohistory.
Psychohistory, that's right. It turns out on so much of the left, it's just a history of psychos. So
yeah, leftoid psycho
of increasingly neurotic flavor. Well, speaking of,
I do say one other thing that's very
please.
important is that since we last heard from Doctress Christine Blasey Ford, CBF, we've had the emergence of Sam Bankman-Fried, SBF, and I just think that the crossover we all need in this new era is for the two of them to start a podcast called BFF, and then it'll be SBF and CBF or BFFs. That's all. I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay.
This is what happens, Ryan, when you relieve me of my hosting duties.
Yeah,
it's like completely unhinged.
You can spin off even more outlandish things. That's okay. So speaking of fictional or science fiction, we should end with a little bit on AI. I saw this tweet, thought it was interesting, and Spencer, you had some interesting thoughts on it, so we might as well talk in public about it. Martyr Maid, who's Daryl Cooper, has a great podcast, which if you don't listen, I encourage you to. It's a wonderful kind of Cook's tour of alternate histories, forgotten social labor movement stuff, all kinds of stuff. Anyway, it's a very interesting podcast. He also co-hosts with Jocko Willink a good podcast where they talk about the intelligence community and the national security strategy and many other things. Go check those out if you haven't. But his tweet was the following: been watching a lot of YouTube videos on doing various jobs around the farm, and I realized that a huge number of them were entirely AI generated, with an AI voiceover, stock images loosely connected to the topic. Then I saw an MMA documentary that used an artificial Joe Rogan's voice, clear because of frequent mispronunciations of names Rogan would never get wrong. Then I heard that a massive amount of the children's content online is entirely AI generated, the cartoon, the dialogue, and the voices. It seems this is where everything is headed in the near term, which sucks, but it's going to lead to a resurgence of dissident culture creation, since willingness to desecrate regime shibboleths will become the only reliable Turing test, the one thing any human can do that AI can't. I thought that was pretty good. It only conjured up in my mind this recent, which I mentioned to you guys before the podcast, this recent thing that I didn't even realize was a thing, which is the proliferation of kind of weird and half demonic children's content across YouTube. It was some parent complaining on Reddit or something that they had this problem. They let their kid watch kids YouTube, and there's this one show apparently with all sorts of weird, sadistic looking, and even more sadistic looking because animated badly and sort of clunkily, so they look more menacing, of kind of characters and evil bad guys coming out of toilets, and they're having a problem with their 4-year-old who is now terrified to sit on the toilet. And it just made me think, I just can't believe any responsible parent would turn their child loose on the bottomless pit of hell that is probably YouTube in general, let alone children's programming YouTube. I mean, my wife jokes that we'll just have to lock the children in the basement in Faraday cages until they're 20 to preserve their souls and their mental health. But I thought this was we will see more and more and more of this. Of course, it's lowering the cost of content creation, which means it's lowering the cost of revenue generation on the internet. And so we shouldn't be surprised that this is proliferating quickly.
Yeah, this stuff is like "Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared." Did you guys ever watch that incredibly weird YouTube series? Which
No.
you totally should, by the way. I mean, it's peak like deranged internet sensibilities, and it appeals to people like me who spent their middle school lunch hours like on E-Bombs World and Homestar Runner and all of these just kind of slightly off like kid style shows. But the thing about it was that we were like, bumbling, teenage bros or whatever, making our way through this sort of kind of complicated, but ultimately well-meaning, like early internet. This is just like you say, Ryan, it's like the demonic and sinister version of that. I think this take by Daryl is like pretty good, and I would go one step further. I would like see your hot take and raise you one and say that a lot of the text that was already on the internet, both in our major publications and then also in like the marketing emails that you get, might as well have been generated by AI, by machine, because they were made by people whose brains had been so hollowed out by HR and whose like rough edges had been so sanded down by our incredibly stifled culture that they were just like, taking whatever word gunk was to hand and copy pasting it. And so originality already came at this really high premium, which is why there is already this like meme subculture. It's because our dominant culture is like super dead. And now we are offloading it onto machines that just literally do what we were already almost functionally doing, which is kind of, fill in the blank for whatever latest Marvel movie we're making, or like spin-off of a spin-off, or you mentioned Foundation. It's like, take the woke pieties, race swap a couple characters, gender swap a couple others, like stick in some stirring speeches that are a dog's breakfast of, second wave feminist cliches. And you've got the Barbie movie, right? Or you've got like whatever thing you were already making. So this does seem to me like secretly a white pill, because by definition, AI technology exists to be mid. Like it churns up all of this stuff that already exists and then finds the like thing that's 99% of the time going to happen. And of course, the whole point of art and like good writing and all that stuff is to find or say the thing that's only going to happen 1% of the time and like hit that black swan, distinctive observation, which it was always a very difficult thing to do. We created this illusion with the internet that all of these people were out there like quote unquote being creative, but they weren't really. They were just doing mid stuff, which now will be done by machines, and the real creative people will continue to be creative. I mean, my last hot take on this is that I was watching Lawrence of Arabia again this weekend and just staring at these absolutely sumptuous panoramas of, of like T. Lawrence camel riding across the desert to fight the Ottomans. And it suddenly struck me that we've been having all these conversations about how quote unquote real AI looks. That look, oh, this new video that was entirely made by a machine, like doesn't it look so real? And comparing the aesthetic of even really good AI to like Lawrence of Arabia, you suddenly realize that what we mean when we say that AI looks real is that it looks like top grade CGI. Because our idea of what looks real in film has already been replaced by this like weird Marvel movie slop for lumpenproletariat that is, basically just kind of ones and zeros. And that's what AI is now approximating to. You go back and you look at the great like eras of cinema, and you look at something like Lawrence of Arabia, and you realize it looks nothing like AI. It's like totally distinct and has its own unique authorial vision, as like all good cinema does, and maybe even categories of like, does it quote unquote look real, aren't the right ones to apply anyway, because the real question is like, what's the artistic vision on display here? And we are probably going to get used to asking that question, and also the parental discernment question, a lot more in the age of AI, because the dangers are just so much more apparent. But they've always been there, and the like prescription is the same, just like, don't be a midwit or a psychopath.
Yeah, well put. There's a great essay opportunity out there for somebody to update Martin Heidegger's famous essay, The Question Concerning Technology. And I would propose that maybe the title would be The Question Concerning Artificial, in scare quotes, Intelligence, in scare quotes, separate scare quotes. It seems like there's a lot to be done there. In the meantime, just remember, kids, that a lot of what you see on the internet was already fake, and now a lot of it is AI generated. So regard it with some skepticism.
Also, I've seen things, I've seen them with my eyes. I've seen things, they're often in disguise. Anybody that can write it and tell me what that's from, I don't know.
We'll give a prize.
Yeah.
That's good. And everyone should rewatch Lawrence of Arabia.
Absolutely.
We considered
I give people advice for watching Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah, please.
It's 4 hours long, which is just like insane. It doesn't feel that long, but give yourself a break. It has an intermission. Watch it on 2 nights. It's like 2 fantastic movies next to each other.
Nice.
And it really does like speed by.
Yeah, we raised the possibility of and discarded of talking about Dune 2, but it did lead me to rewatch Sicario, which is no Lawrence of Arabia, but still enjoyable and darker than I'd remembered. I'd sort of memory hold the whole last scene. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, turn off now, of him just basically, of Del Toro threatening to fake her suicide unless she signs the CIA's, everything was done by the book form. I'd somehow forgotten about that ending. Compelling movie with a great score. I think that, the composer died, I think, in between that movie and the second movie, but it was a great score. And Dune 2 score was great too, I must say. One thing about the chanting priests and the sandworm desert chanting. I've enjoyed the memes. I've enjoyed the memes that have grown out of it, which is people playing that music and videoing their cat underneath the bed sheet to look like a sandworm. Amusing and diverting. Maybe we'll talk about Foundation some other time, Spencer.
I have lots to say about Foundation too.
I was talking with our friend Jonathan Hay at lunch about it the other day, and the virtue of me watching Foundation is I've actually never read the Asimov, so I came to it with naive eyes and found it enjoyable and annoying in various different ways. It's actually why I like the opening of one of the Superman remakes, the one with what's his name? The one that starts with basically Plato's plan for scientific breeding. that one. Anytime you mix, at least for me, you mix sci-fi with a genetic dynasty, it's compelling content. But I realize it's
100%.
That wasn't really in the book at all.
That's like a totally different thing that they had to invent because their casting was so drab and dull. I don't understand. Okay, now I just am going on my
sorry. I shouldn't have wound you up.
Why? Yeah, you really did trigger me, Ryan. Like that. I don't understand why, in addition to finding like minority actors for every role and turning every man into a woman when these characters are obviously supposed to be men, like they also always have to insert just like charisma-free blobs into those roles. Like there's lots of really like not just excellent but also visually striking actors of color, as they say. Like Viola Davis, though she is insufferable as a human being, is like a stupendous actor. There's like all of these, there's like a ton of great talent out there, but all of these sci-fi adaptations that also do the woke casting, for some reason, it's like they have to make you, they're like daring you to object by also making it incredibly drab. And so then they totally ruined the main storyline, and they were like, well, what are we going to do now? And they invented a totally separate story, which is the one that you like, Ryan. And I agree, it's incredible. It's like that guy, I forget his name, that plays the elven being in The Hobbit, like wandering around, chewing up the scenery. He's terrific for the entire thing, but it's like a totally separate movie.
Oh yeah, that actor. I forgot that he was in The Hobbit. That's right. Yeah.
And
Anyway.
in the one.
Yeah, my last point, and I made it to Jonathan, was at least with The Expanse, like the source material, though it's kind of semi-woke, gender bending and sexuality bending source material matches the thing that they made in the movie because it's a pretty contemporaneous product. But when you get back to butchering, Frank Herbert and Asimov, you're going to trigger folks like Spencer and even me. I sympathize.
Oh, the one they do it with. I mean, the really offensive one is Lovecraft, because Lovecraft said, unpalatable things about people of different races, and so
Right.
now they've taken this as reason to just like, it's like a vendetta against him that they have now. To make
Right.
This like the
Yeah. All right. Well, we've come to our final segment. Read the damn site. We have a website, Spencer likes to say, AmericanMind.org. So just wanted to see what people were reading and enjoying. I'll start by talking about this Carson Holloway essay, How the Left Was Left. And he just talks about the pretty obvious transformation, at least to those of us observing it, of the left on, or really switching sides of the left on matters of free speech and old liberal pieties about the free speech, about a sort of skepticism towards war, and how the left has switched sides on a lot of these things. They're now fans of the intelligence community. Thank God for the CIA and the FBI doing whatever they want to thwart Trump. And he concludes with this, I thought, a pretty provocative and interesting variation on the leftism as modern religion. So I'll just read a couple sentences and encourage you to go read Carson Holloway, How the Left Was Left, at AmericanMind.org. The contemporary left, moreover, has not only drifted away from Christianity, but it has embraced a substitute religion, the belief in progress, or that history is a rational force that inevitably lifts society to what the left thinks are greater and greater heights of justice, freedom, and equality. By this change, the left has discarded a religion that resisted authoritarianism and turned to one that encourages it. The left's belief in the historical inevitability of its triumph, far from fostering a benevolence born of serenity, instead causes a kind of psychological rigidity and fragility that inflames its authoritarian impulses. Because of its belief in progress, the left must regard as illegitimate and hence deserving of no sympathy or understanding any effort of the right to reopen questions or issues on which the left has won past victories and which it accordingly believes to have been definitively and permanently settled by the judgment of history. Anyway, go read Carson. Spencer, what do you like?
Terrific. Yeah. Always read Carson, and that is a great piece. My Kingdom for 1,000 people who can write like Todd Bensman. This guy is the best reporter you've never heard of, or maybe you have heard of him. I don't want to like slight him in that way, but he's saying things that, of course, will never ever be run in like the New York Times, but he's getting scoops that the New York Times should be so lucky as to get. He is the Senior National Security Fellow for the Washington-based Center for Immigration Studies. He does a lot of on-the-ground reporting for us, but also deep research. This latest piece is called Biden Broke Haiti, and it is about the fact that the latest Haitian crisis is not simply another kind of, straw on the back of our already overtaxed immigration camel, to use a really tortured metaphor. It is also a crisis in some sense of Biden's own making, because of the cynical politicking he did to get a previous Haitian convoy out of the way during an election year. I won't spoil the story because it really is something out of an engaging, a riveting procedural with original interviews and all kinds of juicy details, including potentially a real ball and chain around Biden's feet coming up in this election year. But go read the piece, Biden Broke Haiti by Todd Bensman.
Hell on earth right now, I think, is what's going on at Port-au-Prince and elsewhere. So say a prayer for the Haitians who have to suffer under gangster rule and the collapse of order. It's just the whole thing's terrible, including cannibalism, I might add, which is just grisly. Seth, what are you reading?
Well, I do want to say that Haiti piece was great. I had no idea. I mean, it was actually like new information, which is good to get, right? Because a lot of the time, we publish stuff that's it's always enlightening and illuminating, but it's interesting to get some facts that have just not been reported. I didn't really know any of that, and it was great to read. A piece I liked also had some good facts in it. Migration is Invasion by Adam Ellwanger, where he just he goes through the current border bum rush, the collapse of our southern border, and looks at it as an invasion and questions whether that's really the right word to use and what defines an invasion. Well, I don't know. Millions of military-age men streaming across the border without an invitation, more or less, kind of works. It's a good piece. Migration is Invasion by Adam Ellwanger.
Yeah, I should add that Adam is the 2023 Lincoln Fellow of the Claremont Institute, and it's just an example of our diverse cast of writers. Adam's day job is professor of English at the University of Houston downtown, and one of the too few bright spots in modern academia. So if you happen to have a kid going there or an acquaintance, tell them to go maybe take a course from Ellwanger. Not your average mid-tier school professor. And I don't say that to insult Adam. It's anyone who can get a decent academic job with Adam's politics these days is doing good work. So, all right. Well, we've come to the end of another episode of the Roundtable. I wanted to thank you all for listening and thank our production and engineering crew, Logan Zeppieri and Jake Gannon. Encourage you to review positively, of course, the Roundtable everywhere we get good reviews. It helps circulate the podcast and bring it to the ears of more listeners and enlightening them on issues like Haiti and the invasion. If you want to support our work, please go to claremont.org/donate. We don't really sell anything besides a few magazines at the Claremont Institute, so we have to sing for our supper. We appreciate everyone's support. And if you want to find the latest of our work at the intersection of ideas and policy in DC and around the country, go to dc.claremont.org. We've had some recent wins lately fighting against diversity, equity, and inclusion madness in places like Alabama and Texas. And all that work comes out of our Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. And of course, read our sister publication, the Claremont Review of Books, at claremontreviewbooks.com. Thank you all for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.